Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for your patience as more attendees file in. This is the third event of the virtual symposium, Recursive Colonialism, Artificial Intelligence, and Speculative Computation. This symposium is organized by the Critical Computation Bureau, a collective of researchers, artists, and writers working at the intersection of technology and culture, computer science and information theory, aesthetics, and politics. Recursive Colonialism, Artificial Intelligence, and Speculative Computation 2020 aims to provide interventions in the technopolitics of racial capitalism and its recursive regeneration, mixing together critical and creative practices and borrowing models and methods from philosophy of technology, Black studies, political theory, computer science and information theory, media aesthetics, and cultural and digital media theories. Please check the manifesto on the website and the online journal issue, Control Societies at 30, published online in social text. We also thank Duke University, which has sponsored the symposium, together with the University of Pennsylvania and the Universidad de Napoli Orientale. For more information on this project, feel free to check out the website recursivcolonialism.com and to follow the event's socials. My name is Ethan Plaue. I will be a host today. My co-facilitator is Alana Parvin. This session of the symposium is called Racializing Algorithms. The format of this session will be as following. Our guests will each talk for approximately 10 minutes. After that, the speakers will address a few questions that you can type into your Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We invite you to type in your questions in the Q&A box at any time during the session. And please remember to state clearly which speaker your question is addressed to. Our co-facilitator, Alana, will pick as many questions as possible, and the chair, me, will address them to the panelists. I also want to remind all panelists that they do not need to check the Q&A box, as all questions will be verbally asked by the chair. The session is streamed live on our YouTube channel, and I will briefly introduce today's panelists. The abstracts of their presentations are available on our website, and we encourage you to consult them. So our first panelist today will be Carly Alderfer. She is a PhD student in the program in literature at Duke University. She works on surveillance and contemporary film and literature in the Middle East. Our third presenter will be Elisa Giardina Papa, who is an Italian artist whose work investigates gender, sexuality, care, and labor in relation to neoliberal capitalism and the borders of the global South. Her work has been exhibited and screened at MoMA in New York, Whitney Museum at the Sunrise Sunset Commission, Seoul Mediacity Biennial 2018, the unofficial Internet Pavilion of the 54th Venice Biennale, the 16th Quadriennale de Roma, Rhizome.org, the Flattery NYC, Institute of Contemporary Art, Milano, among others. Giardina Papa received an MFA from RISD and a BA from Politecnico of Milan, and she is currently pursuing a PhD in film and media studies at the University of California, Berkeley. She lives and works in New York and Sant'Ignazio in Sicily. Giardina Papa is a founding member of the artist collective Radha May. Finally, our third presenter will be Anna Engelhardt, who is a practice-based researcher working with digital media. Her main interests are infrastructure and logistics as an entry point in a decolonial approach towards post-Soviet space. Anna's recent projects include machinic infrastructures of truth, an investigation in the infrastructures of algorithmic surveillance presented as part of the Transmedial Festival 2020 in Berlin and commissioned by Garage Museum of Contemporary Art, Adversarial Infrastructure, interrogation of the Russian Crimean Bridge as functioning under the principles of adversarial machine learning. So welcome everyone, and we'll start with our first presenter, Carly. Thank you.
Hi everyone. Before I start, I want to thank the Critical Computation Bureau for organizing this conference and Ethan Plaue for chairing this panel. In an article from last month, Joseph Cox, a reporter for Vice's Motherboard, detailed the links between data broker Xmode and defense contractors that work with various branches of the US military. According to this report, Xmode pays app developers to incorporate code into their apps that sends users' location data to Xmode. In particular, many of the apps that incorporated this code were directed at Muslims around the world. Xmode described their work with defense contractors as follows, quote, Xmode licenses its data panel to a small number of technology companies that may work with government military services, but our work with such contractors is international and primarily focused on 3 use cases: counterterrorism, cybersecurity, and predicting future COVID-19 hotspots. In this presentation, I want to underline some of the links between tools used for terrorism prediction and COVID tracing, as well as how these tools have transformed in recent years. As Luciana Parisi and Ezekiel Dixon-Roman write in their recent article, Recursive Colonialism and Cosmo-Computation, quote, "The apocalypse finds in technoscientific progress a universal model of civilization rooted in the mathematics of divide and conquer, where space becomes subsumed by the nexus of whiteness, patriarchy, and capitalist logics, which constantly anticipate the end by constantly reproducing its unconditional violence." I suggest here some preliminary ideas for how we might understand the tools developed for tracking the spread of COVID as reproducing, extending, and transforming the violence of the global war on terror, especially in moving from risk and resilience to prediction. An immediate link between these fields is the use of network diagrams to understand them. In particular, both fields have drawn heavily from social network analysis, a tool developed within social anthropology, social psychology, and sociology to map relations among individuals within a certain social context. Social network analysis tends to rely, though not exclusively, on the transformation of data into diagrams, the properties of which can then be analyzed. As can be inferred from my short introduction and from the image here, social network analysis tends to offer a static map of relationships at a certain moment rather than transformations in the network over time. In fact, one of its main shortcomings has been the need for complete data for its measurements to be effective. New developments in the field, however, are transforming social network analysis into a tool for making new kinds of predictions. One of the fields in which social network analysis has been deployed has been the study of terrorist networks. Mark Sageman has been a particularly prominent advocate of social network analysis in terrorism studies. His 2004 book, Understanding Terror Networks, argues against the brainwashing model of terrorist indoctrination. Instead, he claims that the data, quote, "suggest instead that this form of terrorism is an emergent quality of the social networks." However, determining what is and is not part of the network may not be easy due to a lack of clarity on what represents the boundaries of the network. As Sageman writes, quote, "The global Salafi jihad has a very fuzzy boundary. The indistinctness of this boundary raises some epistemological issues on a group and individual level. What represents a node, a link, or a network?" End quote. Due to its dynamic nature, it may be impossible to delimit the boundaries of the jihad. An inability to delimit means that there's no way to gather all the possible information. As in the previous presentation of social network analysis, this hinders the effectiveness of the method's measurement tools. Thus, in the end, Sageman's version of social network analysis can only offer tentative maps. Other tools that draw from social network analysis and terrorism prediction have sought to diagram how an individual becomes a terrorist rather than mapping networks. For example, in 2007, the NYPD released a report entitled Radicalization in the West, the Homegrown Threat. In this, they proposed 4 stages of radicalization: pre-radicalization, self-identification, indoctrination, jihadization, each having unique and specific signatures. Needless to say, these signatures serve to racialize Muslims and, as scholars like Arun Kudnani have shown, justify heightened surveillance of Muslims in the US and around the world. Moreover, with these stages, the NYPD proposed an algorithmic process of terrorist network generation. Tools that counter this algorithmic understanding of radicalization include Google's redirect method, first launched in 2017. This method used Google's AdWords technology to suggest counter-propaganda to potential viewers of ISIS content. Like the NYPD's understanding of radicalization, it seeks to intervene earlier in the process of network generation and solve the problem of the indeterminacy of the network's boundaries by understanding how links are formed. Yet even more tools have been proposed that would not only intervene earlier, but that would make predictions about future behavior. In 2018, US Immigration and Customs Enforcement officials proposed and later abandoned a machine learning technology that would use data gleaned from social networks and the internet, performing a kind of social network analysis to predict the probability of a visitor to the US committing criminal or terrorist acts in the future. Thus, this technology would not just map a given network, it would make predictions about future behavior. Of course, ICE has retracted this proposal, and no mention of it has been made since 2018. However, their proposal should not be ignored, especially since it was dropped due to the technology not existing yet. However, transformations are occurring in other realms that may make this possible in the future. Among the most prominent of these sites at this moment is the epidemiological modeling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Methods of contact tracing rely on the model of social network analysis. As described by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, contact tracing consists of interviewing infected individuals to generate a list of others to whom they might have spread infection, contacting those individuals and advising them to self-isolate, and remaining up to date on the status of those isolating individuals. This model can produce a map of current infections, but like the model of the terrorist network in Sageman, it cannot produce dynamic predictions about the future landscape of the COVID-19 pandemic. The data gleaned from contact tracing can be used to generate of models. These models necessarily have to account for some degree of indeterminacy. As the authors of a recent article in Science modeling possible transmission dynamics of COVID-19 over the next 5 years note, there are many unknown factors that will determine what measures will need to be taken. Yet by manipulating these unknown variables, we can produce a number of models that represent possible outcomes. These predictions offer more than a map of the current pandemic. However, we cannot determine which outcome is more probable. Thus, in the end, much of what such a study offers is a determination of what data is necessary in order to select among the models generated. In the case of COVID-19, we can use the data to model various possible futures, but we cannot determine the probability of these future scenarios. However, other network-based predictive models are driven rather than hampered by this indeterminacy. Another article recently published in Science suggests means through which mobile phone data could be used to both aid contact tracing and generate predictive models, as we saw in the example that opened this talk. Mobile phone data could be used to map existing networks through which infection is being spread, as well as offer real-time data that transforms the network at the same time as mapping it. As the researchers explain, quote, predictive analysis seeks to identify the likelihood of future outcomes and could, for example, leverage real-time population counts and mobility data to enable new predictive capabilities and allow stakeholders to assess future risks, needs, and opportunities, end quote. In this analysis, the mobility of individuals, one aspect of what cannot be predicted in the previous modeling experiment, actually serves as the motor to generate new predictions. The mobility of individuals and the data that this generates updates the models and suggests new predictions. These predictions are then translated into policy measures, which begins the whole cycle again. At no moment is the predictive model static. This proposed model accounts for the dynamic nature of the network in a way that other forms of social network analysis were unable to. It incorporates the model into the network itself by generating predictions from the mobile phone network. I want to conclude with asking a few questions and looking at this quote from the Critical Computation Bureau's manifesto for the conference. Many of the technologies being designed to predict the landscape of COVID hotspots parallel or directly draw from techniques and technologies developed to map terrorism networks and to intervene in radicalization. Yet these new technologies also build on previous techniques. How might we understand these new technologies as extending and reinforcing the logics of the global war on terror? What new opportunities for surveillance has the COVID-19 pandemic offered? If we understand the surveillance and prediction tools of the global war on terror as modes of racialization, how do techniques developed for the pandemic reproduce and extend racialization? Turning briefly to the quote, I suggest that we understand these tools as targeting diasporic movements through marking them as harboring terrorism and disease. Yet these indeterminate movements are precisely driving forward new forms of prediction within recursive colonialisms. Thank you.
Okay, hello, let me share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you see exactly what I see. So happy to be here, and I want to thank the whole Critical Computation Bureau for organizing this. I've been following in the past days the dialogues and the panels, and they were amazing. So I'll try to also give my little contribution to the topic of recursive colonialism, not as a scholar, but as an artist. So I'll quickly talk about two video projects that are part of a trilogy dedicated to surrogate labor and artificial intelligence. These two video works are Technologies of Care and Cleaning Emotional Data. Both are focusing on the invisible human infrastructure of precarious and pauperized workers that are sustaining, on one side, the development of and functioning of artificial intelligence, and on the other side, the autonomy of the technologically optimized liberal subject, or maybe what, for example, Parisi termed 2 days ago in her talk, the Promethean subject. So let's start with Technologies of Care. That is a video installation which traces how pre-existing inequalities in care labor, such as the feminization of caregiving paired with its lack of recognition as a wage work, and likewise the historical colonial division of labor between global South and global North. So how these inequalities have been both intensified and obscured by digital economies. The piece Technologies of Care is based on a conversation that I had with precarious care workers, workers who provide care labor online. So workers who, through a variety of platforms and apps, ease exhaustion, organize data, and optimize other users' lives. So to give you some example, because I don't have the time to show the video that is quite long, is 20-25 minutes long, but among the workers I had conversation with a biology professor from Venezuela who during the night ghostwrites homeworks for US high school students, or a social media fund from Greece that for $5 delivers likes and comments on clients' social media profiles. ASMR artist and fetish video producer from Sicily, that is actually where I'm from, Sicily in Italy, and an online dating coach from United States who runs the client's dating profile, for example, on Tinder or OkCupid, and talk with women in place of her male clients to arrange dates. So basically she does the affective labor before, so during the conversation, but then of course the client go to the date. She doesn't go to the date. And also I had conversation with several algorithms, chatbots, who perform emotional labor by simulating emotional intelligence. Among the chatbots that I had conversation with, I want to focus 1 second on the invisible boyfriend. So what's an invisible boyfriend? The invisible boyfriend is an app that initially started as a chatbot service. But once it became clear that clients were not following for this algorithmically enchanted lover, the founders decided to switch to using invisible human workers instead. That is, the company determined that the computer architecture of deep neural networks necessary to perform convincing emotional conversation was actually economically disadvantageous when compared to the cost of offloading the job to precarious human workers. Hence, while exchanging the text with invisible boyfriend, now the client is connecting globally with approximately 600 writers, gig workers, who interchangeably partner with this account to enable the fantasy of a tireless companion and a tireless love giver. So the invisible boyfriend is a human-powered chatbot that employs anonymous freelancers, writers, as surrogates for a conversational algorithm. And of course, the invisible boyfriend workers are described by those who contract them as temporary placeholders for a future of full automation, a future in which forms of labor that have been historically considered unskilled and non-creative and relegated to those purposely excluded from education and wealth redistribution. So these forms of labor, including care labor, will eventually be replaced by algorithmically powered machines. But even if this is true, what one could ask, what is this particular understanding of technology a proxy for? And for example, according to Kalin Dvora and Neda Atanosovsky, they claim that automation technology can act as surrogate for historically devalued work and workers is based on racist gender imaginaries that have been used to separate the human from the less than or not quite human other. That is, Vara and Atanosovsky mobilize the concept of surrogate humanity to inscribe technology and automation into a longer history of human surrogates in post-Enlightenment modernity, including the body of the slave, standing in for the master, the vanishing of native bodies necessary for colonial expansion, as well as invisibilized labor, including indentuture, immigration, care labor, outsourcing. In doing so, they also gesture to the ways in which these forms of free and visible labor have been the hidden source of support for the supposed autonomy of the liberal subject, propelled along towards his dream of autonomy and progress. So now within this framework of surrogacy, I think that the abstraction and invisibilization of the invisible boyfriend workers can be reframed as a process of double surrogacy. That is, via a mirroring effect, machines are increasingly posing as surrogates for pauperized work, while pauperized workers are increasingly posing as surrogates for machines. So even if AI capitalism keeps promising a future in which artificially intelligent machine will take over the dull, dirty, repetitive labor performed in the past by dispossessed workers, it seems that it must also continue reproducing those pauperized forms of labor to fulfill its initial promise. And this is how I'm pointing to the main topic of this symposium, that is recursive colonialism, which for me does not end with automation. So this process of double surrogacy, pauperized workers posing a surrogate of and for the machine, is likewise traceable in the work of the massive human infrastructure that is currently sustaining the development and functioning of artificial intelligence. It can be traced, for example, in the extensive decentralized workforce of data cleaners contracted by so-called human-in-the-loop companies to process data that are later used to train machine vision systems. These data cleaners basically label, categorize, annotate, and validate massive amounts of data, thereby enabling AI to function. And here is where I quickly reconnect and then close with the last video project that I wanted to talk about, that is cleaning emotional data that I just concluded a few months ago. So for this project, I myself temporarily worked as a human in the loop, and I documented the labor involved in training machine vision systems to see. I particularly focus on how machine vision systems are taught to see via the main true operation of bounding and naming. For example, one of the tasks I perform over and over again, that you can see in the little fragment of the video, was to draw bounding boxes to outline the contours of objects and subjects, distinguishing humans from things, things from humans, humans from animals, animals from things, and so on. So tracing borders to distinguish what belongs to what, and then name that predefined taxonomic belonging. So maybe we could say, it's something I'm interested in exploring, even if this is just an artwork, right? That to teach a machine to see is so much about rescribing the modern and colonial desire of classification, borders, categories, taxonomies, and hierarchy, a sort of reimposing the order of things. And this also became clear to me in several other tasks that I did as a human in the loop, and that are more connected to affective computing. For example, reorganizing and recognizing and rate emotions in phase. in faces. Also producing videos of my facial emotional expression for data set used to train AI to recognize emotions. And this is quite interesting because right at the beginning, when I started to produce these short videos of my facial expression, some of the videos that I produced and then submitted were actually rejected. It seemed that my expression of certain emotion were not matching the crude categories in which they were supposed to fit in. My face was not happy enough and not happy in the right way, I'm not sure. But anyway, I have no idea if the rejection came from an algorithm or, for example, another worker who might have understood my facial expression in a different way, maybe due to cultural reasons. So after the rejection of those videos, I became more and more interested in the logic theories and methods underpinning the taxonomization of emotion within machine vision. So how do machines recognize emotions? And we're basically back to the 19th century with Duchenne de Boulogne, Darwin, and physiognomy. That is, we're back to the myth of universality, transparency, and truth, according to which emotions are universal and can be fully revealed, made transparent, reduced, and measured within an ideal scale that can provide the ground to make comparisons and judgment. Within this framework, emotional states are reduced to discrete facial muscles movement that can be separated, named, and reduced to their smallest units possible, and are recombined to be classified. These that you're seeing right now are the experiment that the French neurologist Duchenne de Boulogne made in the 19th century by triggering the facial muscular contraction of his patients. His intent was to create a universal map of emotions. So basically the same method is used today, only slightly revised in the Paul Ekman fax method. The fax method is used today by the CIA, the FBI, the TSA to detect deception in facial expression, and is also widely implemented in face recognition and machine vision. Is also used for CGI animation, with quite uncanny valley effects. And likewise is used for Animoji, like for the Animoji of the smartphones, so to animate emojis. So it is a method that is crossing the military, industrial, surveillance, spectacle, tech, industry complex, from the 19th century to Hollywood, to your phone, and to the FBI. Okay, so to conclude, because I don't want to take too much time, what I've been exploring with my art practice is that once you try to open up the so-called black box of artificial intelligence and try to understand the political economies within which the black box has originated, inside what we find, I believe, is the old entanglement of capitalism and colonialism. In terms of labor, via this process of double surrogacy, machines that are supposed to pose as paparazzi work, while paparazzi workers keep imposing as machines, and in terms of the logic and the ideology that is implemented in machine vision, that is again the modern patriarchal and colonial project of bounding, bordering, naming, imposing a normative classificatory order of things that exclude opacity, exclude queerness in a more extended sense, and exclude the uncomputable excess, which must be cleaned, for example, by data cleaners, in order for artificial intelligence to work. Okay, and I'll stop screen sharing.
Thank you, Elisa, and thank you, Carly, so much for your presentation so far. And I would just encourage all the attendees to submit questions in the Q&A box, and we'll have a chance after all of our presentations to go to talk about them and to discuss. So I encourage everyone. And now I'll turn over to Anna for her presentation. Thank you.
On the 21st of April 2019, a 10-hour non-stop shift killed Artik Arazaliyev in St. Petersburg, Russia. He was a 21-year-old delivery worker without any health conditions who came from the Kyrgyz Republic half a year earlier. To contextualize his death, one should consider extremely hostile work conditions fueled by overwhelming racism, which extends far beyond work, awaiting workers coming to Russia from its ex-colonies. With continuously changing working visas rules and lack of any consequence for the employers who deny work for non-Slavic appearing people, the job of a delivery worker is inclusive for those not privileged with the white citizenship and appearance. I must briefly define, speaking in English about racializing algorithms, what do I mean by white? How does race function in Russia? Even though the white race might be perceived as existing less straightforwardly in the space of the Second World, rather than in the friction of the First World versus Third World division, it is, in fact, present with the same strength. Racialization in Russia functions through the imposition of symbolic blackness in opposition to the superior white race of Russian colonizers, as outlined by Tlostanova in detail. This does not imply the conventional white-black power hierarchy as somehow non-existent, with black people facing discrimination on a day-to-day basis. Nevertheless, in Russia, the experience of the race for a diversity of racialized subject is less centered around the color of the skin, as Lana Zarasvili points out, requiring attentiveness towards its complex nature. With such an idea of race in mind, it becomes evident that to speak about it, one must break open the process of racialization as it is, open quote, the very process of differentiation and hierarchization, end of quote, that creates entangled intersectional discrimination, according to Dixon Roman. Speaking of delivery workers seem promising for this goal, as one can make a spectrogram contrasting computation of space performed for racialized algorithmic workers and privileged users. Yandex, the Russian Google-like IT giant, which provides mapping solution coupled with delivery, estimates the time needed to cover the distance differently depending on who is using the app. Such quantification of space is characterized by a heavy bias towards extraction of speed from the delivery workers, resulting in continuous production of time-space ratio that is impossible to comply with. This is precisely how Yandex performed the killing of Artik Arazaliyev. Delivery workers are faced with a calculation of space that is impossible to contest, burdened by a complex system of fines and partial automation. With 31 types of penalties in place and fully automated technical support, which basically implies the impossibility to contest the decisions or fines, couriers are caught in the deadly data loop. They provide the company's algorithm with the data extracted from the enforced logistical media of GPS trackers in terms of net rossiter, altering the calculation towards even less time assigned for the tasks. Such process of repetition of data with authority, coined by Dixon Roman as algorithmic, constantly redefines racialized space of workers without access to the calculated space of front-end users. Racialized couriers are forced to resist for the boss, the process overviewed by Sam Adler-Bell, named in case of Amazon workers, who skirted laws to perform more efficiently, move faster. Therefore, the data that extracted from the workers enforced embedded algorithmic bias, open quote, reconfigure the boundaries of difference as well as further magnify the sedimentation of difference rather than merely materializing it, end quote, according to Dixon Roman. Such acceleration of extraction of speed is presented as fully automated, following the lines of Fox-tomation defined by Astra Taylor as a process of hiding human labor in the shiny black box of automation. Taylor provides a useful example of the dumbwaiter, at a time appearing high-tech food elevator, that was introduced to hide the slaves who were making food from the white gaze, guile the chains of the slavery. Similarly, the reconfiguration of racial hierarchy is presented by delivery companies as a fully automated process that does not involve heart attacks, back pains, and vertigo's. Colonial logic of foxtomation that allows speed extraction is essential to perceive spatially. I find cyberwar, understood by Svetlana Matvienko and Nick Deer-Wirford as an intersectional class war that is based in the digital domain, useful for this case. Cyberwar allows me to dissect the computation of space as the continuation of colonial volumetric control. As Catherine Malabou summarizes the point made by Justine Jacques, open quote, cyberwar functions not through a pure acceleration, but rather constructing multiple speeds and spaces. Although there may be an increasing number of connections and interlinkages between and within these spaces, cyberwar does not always fight on the side of connection or disconnection, speed or slowness, end quote. Such discrimination between speed and slowness, I claim, is performed topologically, following the body of work on topology published in the special issue of Theory, Culture and Society in 2012. The acceleration of speed is enacted by the reduction of space through its calculation. The pace is guaranteed by the erasure of territory rather than methods of forward planning, as Manuel de Landa observes in regards to machines of colonial invasion. Craig Martin brings this approach towards control over space further, applying it to commercial logistics. Martin claims that logistical systems perform the symbolic erasure of the terrain through flattening of space. One might think of the app interface that provides a two-dimensional map. In other words, colonial gaze seems to establish the triumph of the surface, overviewed by Ryan Bishop, Laura Kurgan, and others. It is essential, then, to see such calculations topologically rather than topographically. Topology, with its focus on the surface rather than the volume, allows bending and stretching as it is indifferent to distances that constitute physical space. I claim that what the Russian colonialism does to logistical workers is discriminating them into the space that is calculated topologically, one that sees relation as constitutive to the flow rather than movement. It uses a two-dimensional paradigm, weaponizing the third dimension, to create folds and loops, analog to the Möbius strip, to draw connections on the map that make sense topologically rather than topographically. On the one hand, it shows the efficiency of the strategy taken by the Couriers Union and artist collective EF. The Couriers Union has been engaged in imposing strict topographical limitations on the calculation of space performed by delivery companies. They managed to introduce several strict measurements that would allow for abruption of the never-ending stretching of the Couriers' routes. EF, at the same time, brought forward the vertigo of stretching logistical space by looping the flow of the taxi cars in a closed circle. On the other hand, one can weaponize the attentiveness of topology to hollows, like the one that was left to commemorate delivery workers in the statue commissioned after COVID-19 lockdown by top Russian food delivery companies like Delivery Club, whose staff was striking during the same period to get their salaries. In topology, negative space is as important as the space itself. We could see then the hollow in place of the worker as constitutive for the materialized ongoing colonial violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was our presentations for today, but we have a lot of time and some good time, some really great questions for our panelists that we can get right into. I think our panelists can also video themselves, and so that we can have a conversation between ourselves. Thank you. So I'll start off. This one's from Luciana Parisi to Elisa. In your research, in your conversation with the invisible boyfriend, did you find that the algorithm works differently than dating apps? Is there another logic of prediction of what you are supposed to like?
Thank you for the question, Luciana. Another logic of prediction. I'm wondering because my sense is that dating apps, they're kind of like trying to match profiles, right, between users. In the case of the invisible boyfriend, I'm not sure if there is prediction in the sense that you're like really building your ideal invisible boyfriend. Like, I don't know if you saw one of the slides was actually on the website was actually telling you like build your invisible boyfriend exactly as you want it. And you're supposed also to write a little script about how you met. And so the idea of the invisible boyfriend is basically this abstract boyfriend, lover that will always like give you like care and love no matter what, whatever is the time in which you're texting and whatever you're gonna say during your texting. So I don't know if it's too much about prediction, but it's about like this detailed customization. And then of course there is a point of this matrix, right, of invisible workers that are just like several, like 600 invisible workers that are working at different times and different like fragments of time to perform this one lover just for you exactly as you want it.
Thank you so much. We have another question for Carly. This is from Anonymous. You talked about counterinsurgency and counterterrorism strategies that are mirrored in anti-COVID policies of detection. Could you expand on whether these strategies are used against immigrants, especially keeping in mind the anti-immigration policies of Northern America and how they are accelerated worldwide by COVID?
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I mean, on top of what I said, Customs and Border Patrol, as well as law enforcement, have been documented as purchasing similar location data as in the technology I mentioned in the beginning, slightly different version, but the same sort of purchasing of location data that is pulled from mobile phones. And Customs and Border Patrol in particular has refused to say how they've been using this data, so we don't know exactly, but we can guess. And then, on top of something like the militarization of the police that we've talked about a lot, I think we're also seeing the rise of a reliance on Customs and Border Patrol and ICE in particular. And so there's definitely an entanglement of anti-immigration sentiment, counterterrorism, and COVID tracing that I think there's new logics of surveillance coming out of this entanglement that are sort of reinforcing one another. But yes, I would agree that anti-immigration sentiment plays a huge role in the logics that I'm trying to look at.
Thank you. This one's for Anna from Shiv Isar. Does non-knowledge or negative knowledge inform your analysis of negative spaces in any way?
Yes, actually, I would say so. On the one hand, one can think about glissando and the right for opacity and the right to not be knowledgeable in any sense for the colonial gaze. But on the other hand, one can see about the recent research done by Morozov in regards to, in his recent article, Digital Socialism, where he talks about bringing corporations accountable. And he talks there about how logic of computation replaced the accountability of corporations against law. So one can think about my research as in some way advocating for these spaces of information lack or information inefficiency in the neoliberal discourse that would actually protect the racialized workers rather than the companies.
Thank you. This is a longer question. I'll read the whole thing. It could be addressed to either Carly or to Elisa. And it's from Sohail Rezanajad. Not sure to whom I should pose this question, to Elisa for her sensibility towards the insufficiency of data gathered from the so-called terrorists, or to Carly for her views on digital labor. Considering digital labor as extracting value from the social and what is the same, the life being, I'm confronted with a mode of production of value, which I consider coming from a privileged position. Put it another way, the labor of sleep, for example, is a luxury for someone from a global south, since you should have a minimum of comfort to be able to optimize on, or am I wrong? How do you place this type of discrimination, which renders data from someone from the global south worthless, as opposed to the data from north? Do you see this as related to racism, or is it simply the result of consumers' economic power? And anyone can take that, Elisa or Carly or Anna too. I'm sure you have a thought as well.
I'm happy to go ahead and start. I guess what I would say is it depends on what kind of data we're talking about, because if you think about drone strikes being coordinated via mobile phone data, which is often how such drone strikes would be called, that data is somehow very valuable to the military there. And so I think the complication there is about what kind of data we're talking about and who is sort of looking at its value. In certain cases, I agree that the data from someone from the global south might be worth less, but in other cases, it's incredibly valuable.
Yeah, okay, in terms of the value of data, I guess like connected to my work, what I'm trying to do a little bit is that, yes, the user has become the main site of value extraction, right, in techno-capitalism for the extraction of data and then the extraction of social affective qualities. But what I'm trying to think through by addressing labor is that actually I don't think that users are all on the same plane, right? So I make a little bit a distinction between a user, a super user, and then a user worker, right? And what I'm trying to do specifically with technologies of care, how users, mainly from the global north, are extracting in turn value like affect, for example, from users whose labor is cheaper. So in my case, I do make that difference. Hope that answered the question.
We also have a question for Anna. This is from Anonymous. Thank you for amplifying Slots Nova's work. That was a thank you first. How do you see the Russian post-colonial, if there is one, in this age of renewed Cold War?
I would say, I've done actually quite some research on like Russian colonialism, and I would warn against discourses that center Russian colonialism on Cold War narratives, because Cold War is about the fight between US and Western colonialism and Russian colonialism. Whereas I would try and highlight the Russian colonial domination against its own colonies. And one can think about China being very similar in that sense. So I think it would be more useful, instead of talking about Cold War, to talk about similarities, for instance, between Chinese and Russian colonialisms. And yeah, I mean, Russian colonialism is thriving, and one can think about Russian colonial wars happening in Syria and Ukraine right now. Russian digital colonialism functioning as an alien state, or the example of racialized algorithms in place that I touched upon in my work today.
Thank you. This is another one from Carly from Anonymous. How do you think the relationship between discourses around ethics, privacy, and biopolitics within these network analysis apps, might these technologies challenge or nuance the idea of population as the object of biopower?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Just to sort of touch on the first part, I think obvious to me, conversations around privacy and ethics are like very insufficient, and you see that in the quote that I opened with, where Xmode was saying that they use the international data, and that's implying that they aren't looking at U.S. citizens' data, and the sort of conversation there being that it's about privacy for U.S. citizens and not thinking about more globally, talking about the idea of the population as the object of biopower. I think what's interesting in my research has been not about the population, but about the movements of the population. So something about location data and the way these sort of new forms of network analysis are working is being powered by mobility. So it's not the group, the stable group of the population that's interesting here, but the way that segments of the population are moving and how they're moving and where they're moving to. So I think, yes, it would nuance the idea of the population through focusing on modes of mobility rather than characterizing the population as a group.
Thank you. This one's from Ezekiel Dixon-Roman to Elisa. How do you see time and space accounted for or configured or not in the curation of the training data?
Thank you, Ezekiel, for the question, and it's a super interesting one. So I do see time and space accounted for or configured or not in the curation of the trained data. I mean, for sure there is something, and I guess I'm reconnecting to labor and like to, from the point of view of the experience of laboring through those data. And time, of course, is a super interesting aspect of it, because in the same matrix and dynamic in which the work is done, because for me also what is important in this kind of labor is that like really the workers is reconfigured as a packet of time that can be activated according to demand, right? So these data are processed by workers, are not really workers. They're like abstracted into this packet of time that can be allocated to do just a little part of the training of the data set. And most of the time and that also connects with space, right? Because we know that most of these workers are from the global south, but a lot of this work is outsourced in Venezuela right now because of the economic crisis, right? And so that in terms of like, I think space and time and how these data are processed in connection with really the labor of processing the data. Hopefully that is answering your question.
We have another question for Carly and Anna. This is from Lucian. Can you tell us more about how does topological prediction become a mode of control that needs to constantly map indeterminacies into its modeling?
I start? I would love maybe to answer this question coming from the perspective of studies of logistics and contemporary capitalist colonial regimes as coming from the change that is usually coined as logistical revolution that is usually ascribed to happen in the 70s. And basically what happened is companies reached their own glass ceiling in extraction of surplus value from their laborers. So they tried to weaponize the space between the production and consumption side, which literally became logistics. So logistics fueled the outsource of labor and brought to life what what Anatsen coined the supply chain capitalism, with the outsource of everything coming from war to tortures. So this outsource and just-in-time production implies the topological calculation of space, because you need to account for volatility of market that is a lot of it is impossible to predict. So the topological space becomes this flexible substance that allows to stretch the space to make it accountable and make it available for extraction. So one can think about this topological prediction as coming from this second wave cybernetics that fueled the logistical development in the second half of the 20th century.
Just from the perspective of the work that I was looking at, I think what's interesting to me about the sort of the last model that I presented, that is about using the movement data to create the sort of predictive modeling, is the way in which the predictive modeling is meant to like generate policy, but then the policy like then works back into the predictive modeling. So the model itself is actually generating the effects in some ways, which then generate new models. So the model is then like incorporated into this whole process. So it's in some ways, it's not about mapping indeterminacies, it's actually generating indeterminacies as much as it's mapping them. So the way in which the sort of model interacts with the world is transformed in the last example.
We have another question for you, Carly, as well. This is from Tiziana Terranova. How do you think about the different ways in which China and the US/Europe, for example, went about using apps and mobile data for COVID-19 tracking? Are there different models of data, governmentalities emerging with relation to COVID-19 rather than a single global model?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I don't know that much about the ways in which China has been using maps for COVID-19 tracking. And I think one of the main ways in which it's been done is through the Bluetooth technology. And some of what I was looking at is not about like locating users via Bluetooth technology, but actually using mobile phone, like using location data to track movements on a sort of wider scale. So the stuff that I was presenting about was more about wider networks rather than individual users. But I would say, from what I know, there's definitely different models of data governmentalities emerging, and one of those conversations has been about where such apps have been taken up, where they've been enforced, and where they haven't been particularly popular, like say in the US, where I don't know how many people actually use them, but I would assume very few are generally using them, and they haven't been popularized. But other places I know in the Middle East have enforced use of them, and different models of sort of privacy and what kind of data is being collected. Thank you for the question.
And this one's for Elisa from Nika Manik. Have you encountered any applications of affective computing, also in the process of labeling, that distance themselves from FACS and employ the dimensional approach of any other?
No, I haven't. And actually, I'll be interested in hearing from you if you have like more information about the dimensional approach. But in my case, I don't know. It's just like at one point I really started to try to trace this connection between the experiment of Duchenne de Boulogne in the 19th century and how the violent method is still used, and kind of like posing the question of why it's still so uncritical critically embedded in so much of the face recognition and affective recognition systems that that we are using, you know. And I have to say that a whole part actually that I'm developing right now is more connected with the affective reaction to images and paintings, and so I did a lot of tasks on that. And so I'm trying to now open up a little bit that chapter and try to understand what kind of methods are using there in terms of like algorithms.
Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering too, for my own interest is, I think a lot of the presentations had to do with infrastructures of care in colonialism, and how infrastructures of care are made uneven. And this is something we see with COVID, that, you know, some of the, you know, care infrastructures are very much in place, and therefore those, you know, those subjects who receive those can survive COVID much more easily than others. But I was wondering too, if maybe Elisa or Carly, if you saw instances where it's not so much infrastructures of care, but where infrastructures have to be cared for, where in what ways do the various kinds of investments kind of come into the building up of those infrastructures, maintaining all the work that goes into maintaining a uneven infrastructure? Like, where do we perhaps see some of that happening as well? Maybe in either instances.
I mean, on my side, I really like how you put the infrastructure of care and how infrastructure need to be taken care of, because it's exactly the kind of passage I wanted to make between those like true art projects, right? Like to try to understand what happened to care labor online in terms of like inequities, historical inequities, is something have changed or not. But then I open up this whole other chapter on artificial intelligence, and I like the idea to work on the data cleaning, because again, it seems to me that is this kind of like care works that needs to be done now, not to just take care of the liberal subject, but also to take care of the whole infrastructure that is sold, right, to kind of like create these futurities for whole, and that is never the case. And so how much, that's why I'm talking about a human infrastructure, and I like that you're posing it as a human infrastructure of care for the system of artificial intelligence, that just don't work that well without all these massive invisible labor that goes into it, right?
Yeah, I would sort of approach that question from two directions. Like on the one hand, the X mode, some of the apps that were being used or that incorporate this code that sends the location data to X mode were like a couple of Muslim dating apps and various like reminders of when it's time to pray, as well as you know, weather apps, and one of them was like a level for, you know, building shelves and stuff like that. So it's interesting in which kind of, in these sort of like everydayness, but also these sort of care networks that this sort of location data is being siphoned from. But then on top of that, one of the interesting things that came to me out of Elisa's talk was that the sort of the extreme vetting initiative that I talked about in this idea of this like machine learning technology that would predict the possibility of someone entering the US committing a terrorist act in the future, that was actually replaced with a labor contract, and instead of using machine learning technology, they decided, because the technology doesn't quite exist yet or something like that, or didn't exist out of the box, they turned towards using human labor instead. And so I think it's interesting the way in which that aligns with some of what Elisa was talking about in her presentation.
Yeah, this is the question for Elisa from Luciana. Can you tell us more about the difficult condition of double surrogacy in your project cleaning of data? So maybe just more about the double surrogacy as it operates in that project.
Yeah, I'm thinking. Thank you for the question, Luciana, because the double surrogacy for sure is clear, and that's why I wanted to focus on the invisible boyfriend, right? Because like you really do have these human workers who are posing as machine. And what is also strange about the app, that if you look through like the little information, at one point they do tell you on the website that is human powered, and they actually sell that as like a value, right? But then when I started to do a little bit more research, and I also started to read articles that came out, nobody cared somehow, like, because that app had been reviewed in so many Wired, even the New York Times, but somehow nobody posed the question. Everybody had this desire of seeing the invisible boyfriend as a bot, as an artificial intelligence lover, even if the information was there. So there is something for sure interesting about why we don't want to see that part, the surrogacy that goes, again, this like infrastructural care that is sustaining artificial intelligence. And that is also connected with cleaning emotional data, right? Because why do we don't want to open up, right, that part? Why do we want to talk about the material condition of sustaining this dream of autonomy and progress that artificial intelligence is selling us? And I've been living also in the Bay Area. I lived for like a couple of years, so I've been like inside that kind of, continuous, I don't know, way of selling progress through app, and artificial intelligence that just doesn't work.
We also have a question from Luciana to Anna. How does the Uber worker navigate the space of topological prediction? Is there a way for the Uber infrastructure to be navigated otherwise?
It's actually a very good question. I wonder, I must say though that Uber in Russia is not existing anymore because it was bought by Yandex, the company I was mentioning in the presentation. So it would depend on the country, I guess, because even though the infrastructure of algorithmic prediction is based on the similar principles, it varies a lot from country to country based on the data extraction policies. Is there a way for the Uber infrastructure to be navigated otherwise? I actually was discussing this with the EF Artist Collective I mentioned in the end of the talk. And we were thinking about various ways to subvert the contracts that would contemporary art museums have with the logistical companies. How can you use the access to this infrastructure to pay the workers to do things they're not meant to be doing, like organizing a worker union? But I'm wondering, I'm doubtful, to be honest, about how the extraction of the information could be repurposed for the other means. Because if in UK, for instance, as far as I know, there is no legal policy that would allow Uber to fine the workers, they would be motivated to work longer shifts by non-invasive means, like gamification of the process of work. In Russia, it would be fines, but in China, for instance, the surveillance of workers goes even further by with tracking the excessive amounts of information even before COVID-19. So I think some power lays in the denying the data extraction process and allowing the inefficiencies of this infrastructure in place. Yeah.
Along the lines of using technologies in different ways, this question is from Anonymous to Elisa. Thank you for your talk. Could you expand on the ways we could subvert computer vision to be used as a form of resistance?
Exactly, that is the question, right? So thank you for the question. And And that opens up like different scenarios, right? In which some I do follow, some I don't, because there is like one that can be considered is like to repurpose, right? So to take whatever is available right now and to try to kind of like retooling, hack, and repurpose it. But to that, I do add some resistance, and that's why I'm trying to do this work in which I'm going kind of like tracing historically, for example, in machine vision, the kind of logic that is embedded, even if it's updated, right? The 19th century science, right? So I'm not ever completely fully convinced that you can just take machine vision as it is and just hack it or retooling it, because that ideology is so much embedded into it that like really like we need to rethink it, I think, right? And then also working as a data cleaner, of course, there was a part of me in which I was confronted in reimposing the categories that were like already imposed upon me on machine vision, all this like categorizing and labeling of dividing, differentiate, hierarchize the human from the object from the human, the animals from the human, and we know how much of that is coming from a patriarchal, colonial, and also racist like ideology, right? The difference between nature. I mean, like all these like categories and differences. And I did find myself while I was labeling some of the images, sometimes wanted to just change the labels. Like I remember, for example, this image, I didn't have it in the presentation, in which there was this woman lying on a couch, and their t-shirt was actually, the pattern of the t-shirt was like really similar to the one of the couch. And actually, for a moment, I wasn't sure if I wanted to label the image as a woman or as a couch. And I kind of like wanted to create a new queer category of woman couch. And so actually I did write woman couch. And then like while I was thinking about the woman couch, I started to think about Mel Chen books, for example, on animacy, where there is this amazing passage in which she's confusing the girlfriend with the couch with the human, with the girlfriend, right? And she's thinking through, the book is Animacies, and she's thinking through how to, through queer studies, and kind of like how to undo certain categories. So that could be one way. How do we imagine an artificial intelligence, a machine vision system who is based on completely different categories, on categories that are based on opacity, categories that are based on queerness, etc., etc.
I guess that's also a question for Carly too, in thinking about the ways in which contact tracing, does draw together different kinds of intimacies, and you're drawing together the intimacies between the global South and global North. And I'm wondering, like, what kinds of productive intimacies do you see happening maybe in those kinds of moments of tracing, of contacting? Like, what are the kinds of those, as Tiziana Terranova said, those kind of new governmentalities that are also productive of new kinds of relationships that become possible with these new technologies. Do you see any of that happening?
I mean, I'm not sure how this like directly comes out of what I was looking at, but yeah, I think these sort of methods of contact tracing and things like that remind us of these intimacies that we have that maybe that we're not necessarily aware of, and the ways in which, like, where we might have people that we envision as close contacts are actually shown in ways of our like contacts to be different kinds of different people, and different networks and things that are maybe revealed to us through these kinds of technologies. And as well, these like ideas of movement and patterns of movement, and how these kinds of, in the example that I showed, there's like an individual and age group, and sort of the different patterns of movement of someone who's 65 versus someone who's 25, and thinking about these new sort of classifications of individuals by movement, and the ways in which these sort of categories are formed, via our movement around around an area or between areas.
I would answer also. I would say that actually the intimacy and proximity is the only way to approach this process of automation, because actually what in the sense of like logistics, what it does is it tries to hide the human labor inside. And I would say that being attentive towards the intimacy with the person who is driving you from place A to B, or the person who's driving the present for your mom, or like any things like this, is an important counteraction towards the numbing power that these algorithms can produce. So I think that actually intimacy and proximity are a very important is a very important conceptual lens to maybe reformulate this network as a human labor-driven network of care.
Yeah, we have two more questions, one for Anna and then one final question maybe for all the panelists. So the question for Anna is from Anonymous, and maybe this kind of dovetails into what you were just speaking about. To what extent are anti-colonial struggles overlapping counter-logistics forms of labor organization in Russia? Would it make sense to trace this parallelism?
I would say actually, thank you a lot for this question, because it's actually, I think, one of the most productive approaches to Russian colonialism. The thing that is important to know about Russian colonialism is it functions through total denial of its actions. So, for instance, Ukraine had to file in the unprecedented number of pages to prove the atrocities that were performed in the east of Ukraine. And the amount of evidence was bigger than for the Nazi Nazi crimes in the era. So in the colonial landscape of total denial, logistics would be the very productive lens of tracing colonial power play. And one can see actually that you very correctly mentioned that a lot of labor and anti-colonial struggle is happening against colonial logistics, be it logistics of extraction, as in the north of Russia with indigenous people revolting against the oil extraction, or in the south with the extraction of symbolic capital from the areas that were captured to maintain the contemporary colonial policies. So I think logistics, I mean, as Deborah Cohen has dedicated the whole book towards it, she says that logistics allows to map very precisely the contemporary colonial regimes. So I think it's not an accident that we will see counter-logistical struggles happening in the side of colonial violence. And I think the colonial resistance in that manner would be very productive to think logistically, because it would mirror the logistical networks. It would not target the center of empire as much as the periphery of empire, connecting the sites of extraction rather than sites of extraction to the metropole.
Thank you. And so this is our last question for today, and it's for everyone. Going back to differences, and this is also from Anonymous, going back to differences between users, data producers, when data from the global south is used to serve / exploited by data users, analysts in the global north, the proximity between the racialized being and the machine seems to be reinforced, as put forward by Afrofuturism. Do you see in this proximity something that could unsettle data governmentalities, subversive openings in the infrastructure that could only be seen from this relation? Maybe Carly, if we can go through the order of the presenters.
Sure, I can go first. When I was thinking about this question, I was thinking immediately about the ways in which there have been like protests lodged against the use of mobile phone data and location data for drone strikes in the past, and one of them has been about how it's not effective in some ways, or it's imprecise, or or the ways in which people who are targets of this surveillance and drone strikes have learned to camouflage or switch SIM cards or things like that, and the sort of idea of like an imprecision. And I see, like, I want to see sort of a kind of proximity that could unsettle data governmentalities, but the ways in which I've seen protest, or like I've seen sort of ways in which people have decried this kind of surveillance, and the ways in which it's been used has been more to sort of separate this proximity by saying like the mobile phone data is not equal to the person or something like that, and the ways in which that's been looked at as, or that's been attempted to separate rather than bringing together. And I'm not sure how this sort of from what location we could, or like from proximity we could sort of stage this sort of counterclaim, though I'm interested in hearing the other panelists' responses.
I would answer actually with the example coming from Belarus right now. As I hope all of you know, there is an ongoing revolution in Belarus, and a lot of protesters, because the revolution is characterized by constant shutting down of internet by the government. People tend to weaponize the logistical networks by sharing data with them and sharing information about the protests. So they create this care infrastructures of care that allow for protest logistics to happen. They manage to communicate with each other how to avoid police, how to avoid police violence, how to navigate the city safely. So I would say the proximity to machine in that sense can come in the nativity of the production of data, but I would love to pay attention that apart from production of data, it's important to process the data. And the contemporary regimes of extraction are characterized by the denial towards the means of data processing. So even if you have access and you're acquainted with how to produce big data, it's very important to have the means to analyze and process this. So I would say the spatial data is very useful to be in proximity to its production, but I would love to imagine how we could achieve the calculation of space as well.
Yeah, and just to add something really quickly, I don't know if I do have like a fully articulated answer, but I was listening to Hannah, and of course that is a point, right? Who is just producing, who is like a site of data extraction, also in terms of like geopolitics, and who are processing, like what are the institutions and companies who are processing the data, because like really the point about big data, right? That no matter how big data are, they're not processed. They don't really mean anything, right? And a little bit with my work, what I try to understand is like how do these data get processed, and that is where the kind of like power structure is like created, because data don't really mean a lot without a kind of like ideology, we can like I don't know, infrastructure of thought that is determining what that data is supposed to mean and not to mean.
Okay, thank you for all your presentations, and thank you for the questions, everyone, and the attendees, and thank you to Brian D'Aquino and to Alana Parvin for facilitating this session from behind the scenes, and thank you to the Critical Computation Bureau. And so thank you, everyone. It's been a really great session, and please join us for the future ones. Thank you.